Hello, I'm Dr. Annadale from Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Previously, I've reported on my efforts to chase down the origin of this legend that St. Thomas Aquinas destroyed a robot or android that had been built by Albert the Great. I've found two new sources that I'd like to share with you today, one from the 20th century and one from the 17th century. The first of these I owe to a YouTube commenter who recommended to me a book by Arthur Waite titled Alchemists Through the Ages. Arthur Waite was a British mystic and occultist. He died in 1942. He published Alchemists Through the Ages when he was a young man in 1888. Here's what he writes about Albert and Thomas. Michael Mayer declares that he received from the disciples of St. Dominic the secret of the philosophical stone, and that he communicated it in turn to St. Thomas Aquinas, that he was in possession of a stone, naturally marked with a serpent, and endowed with so admirable a virtue that on being set down in a place infested with such reptiles it would attract them from their hiding places, and that for the space of 30 years he employed all his knowledge as a magician and astrologer to construct, out of metals carefully chosen under appropriate planetary influences, an automaton endowed with the power of speech, and which served him as an infallible oracle, replying plainly to every kind of question which could possibly be proposed to it. This was the celebrated android, which was destroyed by St. Thomas, under the impression that it was a diabolical contrivance. Waite gives as his source Michael Mayer, a German physician and alchemist who died in 1622. Unfortunately, Waite does not indicate which of Mayer's works he's drawing from, and he lists 18 different works in the bibliography of his book, so that's going to take some more digging to find the source back in Mayer's works. My second new source was given to me by Pierre Bayle. His entry in the Historical and Critical Dictionary cites Naud, and this is Gabriel Naudé, who died in 1653. He wrote a book in French, the English translated title of which is The History of Magic by Way of Apology for All the Wise Men Who Have Unjustly Been Reputed Magicians, from the Creation to the Present Age. This book was published in French in 1625. The English translation I'm drawing from now comes from 1657. I'm going to quote extensively from this book because I really think this is the goldmine that I've been looking for, giving details about this legend of Albert's android and its relation to Thomas. So here we go. To come then to what is most essential in this chapter, and to what lies in our power to deliver this eminent person out of the quagmire of the magicians, as we have already drawn him out of that of the alchemists. This were soon done if we would but appeal to the judgment of Anthony of Siena and Father Justinian, who writ his life, or to take witnesses disengaged from all interest or passion, Trithemins and J. Picus of Mirandula, who absolutely clear him from this calumny, adding withal that when it is said that Albertus Magnus was addicted to magic, it must be understood of the natural, for fear lest the false opinion of the contrary might give many occasion to imagine that it were unlawful for us to do what he hath done. But since all these authorities conclude nothing if some answer be not made to the proofs ordinarily produced to blast his innocence, not to mention that even from his youth he had such a particular devotion to the Blessed Virgin that she wrought such an alteration in his mind that of an unrefined and unpolished one she made it capable of comprehending all things, we are to consider that these proofs have no other ground than that of 2 books falsely published under his name, and that Androides, which hath given occasion to thousands of fables and impertinencies frequent in authors. If, after all this, Albertus may be charged with anything of magic, it must be on some other pretense than that of these 2 books, since it is clear, from what hath been said, that he never had any hand in them. All therefore we have now to do is to refute their error, who are persuaded that brazen heads made under certain constellations may give answers, and be, as it were, guides and counselors upon all occasions to those that had them in their possession. Among these is one Ypres, who affirms that Henry de Villene made such a one at Madrid, broken to pieces afterward by an order of John, King of Castile. The same thing is affirmed by Bartholomew Sibelius, and the author of The Image of the World of Virgil, by William of Malmesbury of Sylvester, by John Gower of Robert of Lincoln, by the Common People of England of Roger Bacon, and by Tostatus, Bishop of Avila, George of Venice, Del Rio, Sibelius, Ragifus, and Deliker, and others, too many to mention, of Albertus Magnus, who, as the most expert, had made an entire man of the same metal, and had spent 30 years without any interruption in forming him under several aspects and constellations. For example, he made the eyes, according to the said Tostatus, in his commentaries upon Exodus, when the sun was in the sign of the zodiac correspondent to that part, casting them out of diverse metals mixed together and marked with the characters of the same signs and planets, and their several and necessary aspects. The same method he observed in the head, neck, shoulders, thighs, and legs, all which were fashioned at several times, and being put and fastened together in the form of a man, had the faculty to reveal to the said Albertus the solutions of all his principal difficulties. To which they add, that nothing be lost of the story of the statue, that it was battered to pieces by St. Thomas, merely because he could not endure its excess of prating. But to give a more rational account of this Androides of Albertus, as also of all these miraculous heads, I conceive the original of this fable may well be deduced from the Teraph of the Hebrews, by which, as Mr. Selden affirms, many are of opinion that we must understand what is said in Genesis concerning Laban's gods, and in the first book of Kings concerning the image which Michael put into bed in David's place. For R. Eleazar holds that it was made of the head of a male child, the firstborn, and that dead-born, under whose tongue they applied a lamen of gold, whereon were engraved the characters and inscriptions of certain planets, which the Jews superstitiously wandered up and down with, instead of the Urim and Thummim, or the ephod of the high priest. And that this original is true and well deduced, there is a manifest indicium in that Henry Diafia and Bartholomeus Sibelius affirm that the Androides of Albertus and the head made by Virgil were composed of flesh and bone, yet not by nature but by art. But this being judged impossible by modern authors, and the virtue of images, amulets, and planetary sigils being in great reputation, men have thought ever since, taking their opinion from Trismegistus, affirming in his Asclepion that of the gods some were made by the sovereign god and others by men, who by some art had the power to unite the invisible spirits to things visible and corporeal, as he is explained at large by St. Augustine, that such figures were made of copper or some other metal, whereon men had wrought under some favorable aspects of heaven and the planets. Which opinion, since it is the more common, it is fit we earnestly buckle with, and show that it was not without reason refuted by St. Thomas, William of Paris, and Niphus, as false, absurd, and erroneous. To prove this the more easily, we are to suppose that speech is the action of some thing that is living, and is not performed but by the voice, which is defined by St. Thomas, after Aristotle, sonus ab ore animalis prolatus. For it must needs be granted that, if these heads spoke, it was either because they were living and animate, or that the demons spake in them. If the former, the soul whereby they did it must be vegetative, sensitive, or rational. It could not be vegetative, because according to the faculties of said soul, such bodies should be ranked among plants, be nourished, increase, and produce their like. It could not be sensitive, for that, besides the faculties of the vegetative soul, it presupposes two more, which are particular to it, and never granted to those statues. Much less, then, can it be rational, unless we grant withal that they could apprehend the species of things, discourse, remember them, and, in a word, be like us. Moreover, if these heads and statues were really such, that is, living and animate, it was either by an accidental form or a substantial. Not the first, at least according to the opinion of all philosophers, who will never grant that to discourse, to speak, to teach, to foresee what is to come, and such effects can depend on an accident and not on a substance. The latter is less possible, because such statues could not receive that substantial form till they had been divested of what they had before, which there is no color to imagine they should have done by a simple transmutation of figure, since the form of the copper and of their matter was still such as it was wont to be. Further, I would gladly know where was their motion, the first indicium of life, where their senses, the sluices of all knowledge, and in a word, not to ravel ourselves into thousands of difficulties arising from the original and operation of that soul, where were the parts and organs necessary for their discourse and ratiocination? Nor does it avail anything to grant that the demons have spoken in them, for it must be done either as the soul does in the body, by the assistance of its organs, or as one should do that answers in a chest or some broken pot. The former way is impossible, such statues being not furnished with muscles, lungs, and epiglottis, and what is requisite to a perfect articulation of the voice. The latter is as ridiculous, for, if it be true, why should those men take such pains to make a man rather than a trumpet, or a head rather than a bottle, since the devil might as well answer by the one as the other, and that if he hath heretofore uttered his oracles in statues, it was to engage men to adore them, to the contempt of their Creator, whereas there is not the least mention of any idolatry in the stories of this Androides, and these fine heads. So that we may well conclude with the royal prophet, the idols of the Gentiles are silver and gold, they have mouths and speak not, nor is there any breath in their nostrils. All we have to do, the reasons of Trismegistus being fully refuted by Niphus, being to satisfy the authority of Tostatus, one of the most ancient and most authentic patrons of Albertus's Androides, that so we may at length give a final sentence against the vanity of all these fables and pernicious falsities. I must indeed confess that Tostatus was the most learned, nay, the miracle, if I may so express myself, of the learned men of his age, since that, being counselor to the king, great referendary of Spain, and professor in Salamanca of philosophy, divinity, civil and canon law, and all at the same time, he hath nevertheless written such a large and laborious commentaries, that were we not certain he died at 40, they were enough to persuade us that he had lived an entire age. But when I find him affirming therein many things justly accounted fabulous by the world, as, for instance, what is said concerning the birth of the prophet Merlin, the Magick of Virgil, the Brazen Head that discovered the Jews in Spain, a certain earthen Hebron that was good to eat, the Androides of Albertus Magnus, and abundance of the like, I cannot but look on them as so many black patches on his humanity. Nay, if we appeal to Scaliger, we must ingeniously acknowledge that Latin. To reinforce which argument, if any shall with Aristotle insist that common report cannot be absolutely false, and consequently that so many authors would not have spoken of the Androides of Albertus if something had not been in the wind, I shall finally answer that my design is only to show that he could not, by the help of superstitious magic, make a statue that should give him answers in an intelligible and articulate voice upon all the doubts and difficulties he proposed thereto, as well as things present as to come, and not absolutely so deny that he might compose some head or statue of man like that of Memnon, from which proceeded a small sound and pleasant noise, when the rising sun came by his heat to rarefy and force out by certain small conduits the air which in the cold of the night was condensed within it, or haply they might be like those statues of Boetius, whereof Cassiodorus, speaking, said, Latin, for such I doubt not but may be made by the help of that part of natural magic which depends upon the mathematics. It were therefore much more rational thus to interpret whatever hath been said of this Androides, than to prostitute the reputation of Albertus Magnus, Robert of Lincoln, and so many other persons of considerable quality to the judgment of certain authors who are so easily carried away with the slender assurance of a common opinion. So that is Naudé's account of Albert's Android and his extensive refutation of these popular stories about it. That's as far as I've gotten for right now. There are some sources that Naudé cites that I may chase down in the future. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story as much as I've enjoyed telling it. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.